My name is Florian Irmitzer. I've got Chander Velu with me today, and he's going to talk about his research about business models and their evolution.
Well, thank you very much, Florian. This is Chander here. Thanks for being here today. So the topic of the talk today is a systems perspective on business model evolution. Oops. I'm just trying to move the slides here. Yeah, so look. Right. So the content of my talk today will cover the motivation behind the research. I'll try to propose a perspective on business models using complex system or complex thinking systems theory as an approach. And we'll also discuss the case of business model evolution in an agricultural information service provider, a mobile agricultural information service provider in India. And the paper is published in a journal called Long Range Planning, and the reference is at the bottom of the slide. Now, just to provide some context, this is the market for agricultural produce in India. So in particular, agricultural produce in India has got various problems. In particular, there's a mismatch in supply and demand due to the distance of markets from the farmland in India. So imagine that a particular farmer produces a particular crop, and the market that he or she needs to go to sell the particular produce may be 10 or 15 miles away. So therefore, there is the issue of all farmers going into a single market, and the price in that market collapses, whereas the price in an adjacent market is very, very high. So therefore, there's significant price variation up to 20% compared to nearby markets for particular crops. In addition, farmers in India tend to earn as little as 25% of the value of the final price of their raw produce, which compares less favorably to other developed countries where the farmers may earn up to 40 to 50% of the final produce, partly due to there being many, many intermediaries between the farmer and the final marketplace. Now, in order to overcome this particular problem, a company, a major blue chip company called Alpha, launched a new proposition based on using mobile telephony called I Agree in India in 2007. Now, the proposition is very much along the lines of farmers buying or getting access to a mobile phone and buying the service of this company called I Agree through scratch cards that would enable them for about $5 per quarter to get spot prices that are localized depending on the type of crop that they are delivering, localized weather forecast, crop advisory, commodity and news information. Now, this particular organization, I Agree, delivers the proposition in local languages to over 2.75 million farmers in over 50,000 villages across 450 crop varieties. Initially, they started off in 3 states and then subsequently expanded to about 18 states in India. Admittedly, there are several benefits of the I Agree proposition. As we can see, a number of farmers have articulated what are the benefits, in particular improved general knowledge of crop cultivation, increased profits, increased understanding of weather risks, and so on and so forth. And the I Agree estimates that they have generated up to 2 to 3 billion in additional income for farmers, while over 50% of farmers have reported reduced spending on agricultural inputs. Now, initially, when I Agree set up its proposition in India, they developed a very, very fully integrated business model, i.e. sourcing the content, i.e. local agricultural prices across different villages in India. They had their own people or had collaboration perhaps with some of the local universities and post offices and so on and so forth. They cleaned the data, distributed through their own systems, and they provided customer servicing afterwards as well. Completely fully integrated business model. But in order for I Agree to be sustainable, they needed to evolve that business model as they scaled up their proposition across India. So there were 3 stages in which the business models evolved. The first stage was between 2007 and 2012, where it was predominantly a mobile-based information service for farmers, along the lines I mentioned earlier, providing crop prices, weather forecasts, best practice, and so on and so forth. The second phase between 2012 and 2013 involved building a transaction platform that aggregated the supply and demand for crops and therefore enabled trading of these agricultural crops on an electronic trading platform. Finally, in phase three, the business then evolved to a different business model whereby they decided to provide the information about farmers and the use of these crop prices and so on and so forth to banks and other agriculture related businesses and charge them because it reduces the cost of credit evaluation and marketing for these banks. Whereas the service itself was provided for free to the farmers. Now, the question we ask in this particular research is, what are the organizational capabilities that such new firms need to have that enable them to evolve their business model from one type to another, and so on and so forth. Now, in order to do so, it's useful just to recap what we mean by business models. I tend to use a very simple framework, the 4 V's of a business model, which basically asks the question, what exactly is the value proposition to the customer? How is that value created? What is the means by which the firm goes about capturing the value, looking at the revenue and cost structure? And what is the network of organizations or firms that the firm needs to engage with in order to create and deliver the proposition to the customer? Now, typically, when we talk about business models, there are 2 aspects to this. One is the cognitive manifestation, looking at particularly the mental model of management to understand the cause and effect of their actions. The second is the economic manifestation, which is effectively articulating the activity systems within the firm and the economic implications of those activity systems. Now, in terms of looking at business models, one of the contributions that we highlight in this paper is to provide a systems perspective on business models. So what do we mean by system? A system typically is composed of interrelated parts or elements. So we can actually make a distinction between the different components. A system typically also has we can look at a system as subsystems with parts and wholes. So we can break down an overall system into component parts and to look at the system as a whole. And we can articulate a system in terms of relationship between these different components. And finally, a system typically also has something called perspectives, i.e. different agents or stakeholders who are involved may have different viewpoints about what exactly the system is all about. Now, a complex system is then one that is made up of large number of parts that interacts in a non-simple way. And the general systems theory examines how systems interact with the environment in order to take energy from it and transform it into an output. Now, we can make a case that a business model, to some extent, is a complex system because it has interrelated components, as we talked about earlier, the value proposition, the value creation, the means of capturing value, and the value network, and it converts inputs into some valuable output to the customer itself. So therefore, in this particular research, we take the general idea of systems theory and apply it to understand how business models evolve by understanding how general systems themselves evolve. Now, the key findings from the research is there are 3 principal concepts that come out of this research based on an extensive set of interviews and following longitudinally this particular company called I Agree in India. And the 3 notions that or concepts that we have articulated is this notion of balanced redundancy, requisite variety, and cognitive discretion, which I'm going to explain in a second. Balanced redundancy refers to cases where the function of one element can be performed by another element or component, either partially or fully. Requisite variety refers to the extent with which components of the system obtain different sources of information to understand the environment better. And cognitive discretion refers to the freedom to perceive and construct different or idiosyncratic meaning in terms of perspectives and views. So how does this 3 notions come out from the research? So if you take the first phase of evolution between 2007 2012, the mobile-based information services for farmers, one of the big challenges that this firm faced when it launched this proposition among farmers in India is farmers often bought the I Agree service for a particular season. So a crop may have multiple seasons, Some crops could have several harvesting seasons per year. However, the farmers often did not need the I agree service in between harvesting season for the crop. So imagine there's a crop that has 3 seasons, and there is a gap of about a month or 2 between the seasons, and the farmer subscribes to the proposition in the beginning and then lapses, doesn't subscribe to the proposition in between, and forgets or requires the farmer to be reminded to resubscribe. Therefore, farmers often needed to be reminded to renew their I agree service in the following season, as they often were busy with intermediate crop-related issues. Now, one of the things that this firm did is they experimented with different proposition by stretching their resources. And one of the key elements that came out of this findings is to build redundancy among the components. So some of this code says we had our staff, and there were overlaps in skills among the staffs. And in particular, they often needed to redeploy resources quickly from one initiative to another by technically experimenting with different propositions. And here's an example. We learned that staff out in the field were happy to spend their free time in the evenings to do some extra work, which helped them earn some additional income. So therefore, what the firm did was to use the resources and have overlapping functions among the people and its other resources. And in the process of doing that, it managed the resource fungibility of how the organization worked. And admittedly, it's a startup firm. It is growing. It needs to be very, very flexible in terms of its resources. Secondly, the firm made sure that its cost base is rather variable. So on the one hand, you want to have a system that overlaps in terms of its resources and functionality, but we don't want too much of that because that is going to create excess resources. So in order to manage this tension, the firms provided some level of constraint of its resources. So in particular, they discovered the farmers needed motorbikes to go around the farmland, and they thought that one of the best ways to overcome the lapses in repurchasing the service is to bundle the I agree proposition as part of the motorbike purchase. So as the farmers went out to buy motorbikes, the I agree proposition to deliver information about crops was bundled with the motorbike purchase, and I agree then gets paid by the motorbike dealer based on the number of motorbikes sold. Therefore, there is much more variation or correlation between the variable cost and matching the appropriate income. So in this way, the resources are managed in a more constrained basis. And one of the key lessons that we learned from this process is if we look at other biological systems, for example, a yeast, which is commonly used in making bread, displays functional genetic redundancy. So you find that in a yeast, many of the genetic functions overlap with each other, and therefore it is very, very stable in terms of results, mutation, and stresses from the environment. And that kind of redundancy is, on the one hand, very, very helpful, and this is what we saw within this organization. They built a lot of redundancy and overlaps in their functions and resources, but at the same time, they manage those excessive resources through some kind of balanced redundancy to enable distinctions between the components that we talked about around the business models to come out more efficiently or to be leveraged better. Now, moving on, in phase 2, the firm moved from just providing information through the mobile apps and the mobile phone to providing a transaction platform for agricultural crops between buyers and sellers. So the question arises as how did the firm evolve from one business model to another? Now, one of the interesting findings that we came across is that farmers typically did not have sufficient bargaining power in enabling the sale of their crops. This is because the farmers who typically purchased motorbikes were farmers with 2 or 3 acres of land, and it was far too fragmented to actually gain any benefits from these negotiating prices for their crops. However, with such small holding of crops, they were often unable to get a good price for their crops as a result. So therefore, one of the important things that we observed in the way the firm evolved its business model is to understand the details of the farmer's purchasing pattern, which is very key. So for example, the sales team at some of the major fertilizer companies that were providing fertilizers to these farmers would meet the farmers through the life cycle of the crops, and hence were in a good position to provide crop advisory services in order to enhance the sale of fertilizer. So imagine that is actually competing directly with the I agree proposition, because these sales staff of the fertilizer company are talking to the farmers on a regular basis and providing crop advisory services. which the I agree proposition is also trying to do. But such information was coming from varied sources, both internal and external within the firm. And for example, different distribution channels, call centers, operations, sales and marketing teams, and so on and so forth. And what I agree was able to do is to collate this intelligence through these various sources to provide and realize that provision of information alone through the mobile phones was not enough to make it viable. So this is an example of developing insights through component knowledge, i.e. we are understanding the different components of how the business model works in order to make the judgment to say, well, information per se is not enough to make this business model viable. We need to evolve it. Whilst there was appreciation of the senior management team to understand the big picture of the market, all right. In particular, looking at things like food security and sustainability was a major issue for the government in reducing uncertainty of food supply, which is a critical objective driven by the government. And the firm basically realized, based on this quote here, it dawned upon us that part of the problem with food security is the imbalance between demand and supply of commodities. Therefore, they felt that if we were to provide means of aggregating the supply and demand and enable trading of commodities, this would go some way in resolving the issue of just providing information. So on the one hand, they had very detailed component knowledge. On the other hand, it was about understanding the architectural knowledge of how these different components and systems work. And in the process of combining those component architectural knowledge, they effectively obtain what is called, in systems thinking, requisite variety. I.e. requisite variety is to enable better balance between specialization, i.e. understanding the details, as well as understanding the broader scope of how a system works, to get a better perspective and understanding of the relationship between components to evolve from just providing information to enable trading. Now, finally, in phase 3, the firm moved to an engagement-based solution provider to the banks. Now, effectively, they realized this selling information or providing just a transaction platform was insufficient, and therefore they decided to provide information to the banks based on the usage pattern of the farmers in order to reduce the credit and marketing costs for the banks themselves. Now, how did this come about? On the one hand, based on our interviews, what happened was the farmers were receiving these information on 140-character text, SMS text. And sometimes they would streamline the use of the term, things like water would be called H2O, and the farmers would often come back and ask, what does H2O mean? They have to explain, oh, that's a kind of water, and they'll ask, is it Kinsley or Bisleri, which is a different type of branded bottled water? And there's a whole process of trying to answer this series of questions to say, this is the type of water, this is the type of seed, and so on and so forth. And through this process of breaking down and answering a series of questions, the firm was following what is called a deductive logic, i.e. finding a solution through a deductive logic of answering a series of questions from the farmers to find solutions. Now, on the other hand, the board was also looking at the bigger picture of saying, right, okay, we're not making enough money based on transactions and information. What are the other type of models we can look at? So they look at Netflix, Google, Apple, and so on and so forth, and decided that one of the business models that work in this digital environment is to be able to give some proposition for free in order to build enough customers and generate revenues elsewhere. And this is an example of finding a solution through an inductive logic, using analogies and so on and so forth. And that, again, enabled the firm through what is called cognitive discretion, again, a term looking at systems, by combining deductive and inductive logic that enable the changes in perspective. So going back to the notion of viewpoints and perspective of the underlying business model, it enabled the firm to change its business model and provide the engagement-based business model proposition to the banks. So therefore, just to remind ourselves, the key findings is this notion of balance redundancy, managing resource fungibility and resource constraint to understand the distinction between the systems. A requisite variety, which is getting information both in component knowledge and architectural knowledge to understand the part-whole relationships. And finally, this notion of cognitive discretion. The business model has a cognitive framing, and using both deductive and inductive knowledge changes the perspectives of the management on the cause and effect propositions, and therefore enable the business models to evolve from one to another. So in summary, developing organizational capabilities based on system thinking helps business model evolution. Here's an example, our preliminary findings looking at what is called micro foundations of dynamic capabilities, enabling the firm to change its business model, evolve from one to another using this perspective of balanced redundancy, requisite variety, and cognitive discretion. And I might say this is very much an early exploration of the systems thinking approach for business model evolution. And there seems to be a lot of opportunities to explore this idea further. And if you'd like to read in more detail the concepts within the paper is available and published in one of the academic journals called Long Range Planning.